What would you risk for 10 strangers you've never met, whose names you don't know, whose faces you'll probably never see? When you're at 22,000 feet over the North Sea in February 1945, when you see a crippled B-17 bomber trailing smoke and fire with German fighters closing in for the kill, when every rational calculation says those men are already dead, and diving to their defense will probably just add your name to the casualty list, what makes you push the stick forward and dive anyway? Is it duty or is it something deeper? The fundamental human inability to watch people die when you have even the smallest chance to help them. I'm 95 years old, and on February 14th, 1945, I was a P-51 Mustang pilot who made a decision in about 3 seconds that defined the rest of my life. I dove into a swarm of German fighters to protect a dying bomber crew, fought the most desperate air battle of my career, and somehow survived to see those 10 men make it home. This is the story of that day, of a choice made without time to think, of discovering that sometimes the right thing and the suicidal thing are the same thing. My name is Robert Edward Mitchell, and I was a 24-year-old captain in the 357th Fighter Group, 8th Air Force, flying P-51D Mustangs out of Leiston, England in early 1945. I'd been flying combat missions since D-Day, had logged over 200 combat hours, had 5 confirmed kills and 2 probables, and was considered a veteran pilot in a group that had high standards. The P-51 Mustang was the finest fighter aircraft of the war, maybe the finest piston engine fighter ever built, a beautiful marriage of American engineering and British aerodynamics that could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back, could dogfight with the best German fighters, and could do it all while looking elegant in a way that few military machines ever achieve. The P-51D I flew that day was named Tennessee Belle, after my home state, painted with the distinctive red nose markings of the 357th Fighter Group, armed with 6 50 caliber machine guns, with 1,180 rounds total, and equipped with 2 external fuel tanks that extended our range beyond what any previous fighter could achieve. The Mustang had a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine built under license by Packard, 1,490 horsepower, that could push the aircraft to over 440 miles per hour, with a service ceiling above 41,000 feet and a range of nearly 2,000 miles with external tanks. It was fast, maneuverable, deadly, and beautiful, the kind of aircraft that pilots fell in love with, that became extensions of ourselves rather than just machines we operated. Our mission on February 14, 1945, was a standard bomber escort, protecting B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators attacking oil refineries near Hamburg. Valentine's Day seemed like an ironic day to be trying to kill Germans and protect American bombers, but the war didn't observe holidays and the strategic bombing campaign continued regardless of dates or sentiment. We'd taken off at 800 hours, formed up with the bomber stream, and escorted them to the target through heavy flak and scattered German fighter opposition. The mission had been relatively routine by the standards of February 1945. German fighter response was weakening as fuel shortages and pilot losses took their toll, and most of our work consisted of keeping station with the bombers and watching for threats that rarely materialized. The trouble started on the way home, after the bombers had completed their attack and turned west toward England. We were over the North Sea, maybe 100 miles from the English coast, at 22,000 feet, when I noticed one B-17 falling out of formation, dropping behind the protection of the other bombers, trailing smoke from its No. 3 engine. The bomber had probably taken flak damage over the target, had been nursing the damaged engine trying to stay with the formation, but had finally lost enough power that it couldn't maintain altitude and speed. Falling out of formation was a death sentence for bomber crews, meant you lost the mutual protection of the formation's mass defensive firepower, made you vulnerable to German fighters who specialized in picking off stragglers. I radioed my flight leader, Captain Morrison, and reported the straggler. He acknowledged, said he'd seen it, but our primary responsibility was protecting the main formation, and we couldn't break off to cover one damaged bomber unless it was directly threatened. Standard doctrine made sense from a strategic perspective, but hard to accept when you're watching 10 men in that falling bomber realizing they've been left behind. I maintained my position in the formation but kept watching that B-17, dropping further behind with every minute, losing altitude slowly but steadily. And I remember thinking those poor bastards were going to end up in the North Sea if they couldn't maintain altitude long enough to reach England. Then I saw them, 4 German fighters, looked like FW-190s from their silhouette, diving from above toward the crippled B-17. They'd been lurking at altitude waiting for exactly this situation. A damaged bomber separated from the formation and its escorts. An easy kill that would let them claim credit without fighting through the massed defensive fire of a full bomber formation. The B-17's gunners must have seen them too. I could see tracers arcing from the bombers' positions. But one bomber against 4 fighters was a hopeless mismatch. Those 10 men were about to die, and nobody was in position to help them except me. And I was 3 miles away and would have to abandon my formation to reach them. I didn't think about it, didn't weigh options or calculate odds or consider the tactical implications. I just rolled Tennessee Bell inverted, pulled the stick back and dove, leaving my formation without permission, violating doctrine and probably orders, committing myself to a fight that I'd almost certainly lose. The Mustang accelerated in the dive, airspeed building past 400 miles per hour, the wind screaming past the canopy, the controls getting heavier as speed increased. I had maybe 30 seconds before the German fighters reached firing position on the B-17, 30 seconds to cover 3 miles and position myself to intercept them before they could deliver killing fire on that bomber. The dive was steeper than recommended, G-forces pushing me down into my seat, vision narrowing from the blood draining from my head, airspeed indicator approaching redline where structural failure became a real possibility. But I needed every bit of speed, needed to close the distance before those 4 FW-190s murdered the bomber crew I was trying to protect. I leveled out at about 20,000 feet, maybe 1,000 feet above the bombers and the attacking fighters, positioned for a high-side attack that would give me energy and position advantage. The lead FW-190 was lining up his shot on the B-17, was maybe 5 seconds from opening fire, when I opened up with all 650 calibers from about 600 yards. Too far for accurate fire, but close enough to make him break off his attack. The German pilot saw my tracers, saw a P-51 where no P-51 should be, and broke hard right, abandoning his attack to deal with the unexpected threat. His wingman followed, and suddenly I was in a turning fight with 2 FW-190s, while the other 2 continued their attack on the bomber. The FW-190 was a formidable aircraft, heavily armed, well-armored, powerful, but less maneuverable than the Mustang, especially at altitude where the Merlin engine gave me an advantage. I pulled into a hard climbing turn, using the Mustang's superior power-to-weight ratio at altitude to get above the FW-190s, positioning for another attack. But while I was maneuvering against 2 fighters, the other 2 had pressed their attack on the B-17. I could see them firing, could see their cannon rounds hitting the bomber, could see pieces flying off the B-17's wing and fuselage. The bomber's gunners were returning fire, tracers streaming from the tail in waist positions but damaged and slowed. The B-17 was a sitting duck. One of the FW-190s made a head-on pass, probably hit the cockpit or nose, and the bomber nosed over, started descending more steeply. Those 10 men were dying and I'd failed to protect them, had engaged 2 fighters while the other 2 finished the job. Something in me snapped. Some combination of rage and desperation and refusal to accept what was happening. I abandoned the turning fight with the 2 FW-190s behind me, ignored the fact that I was giving them a shot at my tail, and dove after the 2 fighters attacking the bomber. Stupid, tactically insane, presenting my 6 to enemy fighters was the cardinal sin of fighter combat. But those 10 men were dying, and I was their only chance, and tactical wisdom mattered less than doing something, anything, to give them a few more seconds of life. I caught the trailing FU-190 with a deflection shot, firing from about 300 yards at an angle, walked my tracers into his fuselage and wing root. Pieces flew off the German fighter, smoke erupted from his engine, and he rolled inverted and dove away, out of the fight if not destroyed. 1 down, 3 to go, but now the other 3 were all maneuvering to kill me. And I was alone at 19,000 feet over the North Sea with no support and rapidly depleting ammunition. The next minute was pure chaos. 4 aircraft in a 3-dimensional knife fight. Everyone trying to get position on everyone else, firing brief bursts when opportunities presented, braking hard when someone got angles on you. I was vaguely aware that the B-17 was still flying, still descending, but not in the death spiral that would mean the crew had lost control. Someone in that bomber was still fighting, still flying, still trying to get his crew home. I had to keep these German fighters busy, had to prevent them from finishing what they'd started, had to buy time until other Mustangs could arrive, or until the bomber made it to the protection of the English coast. I got position on another FW-190, a brief window where he was turning and I had deflection, and I fired everything I had left, maybe a 2-second burst, saw hits on his wing and cockpit. The FW-190 snap-rolled, lost control, went into a spin, and I didn't have time to confirm if he was dead or just disabled because the other two were on me, firing, cannon rounds passing so close I could hear them over the engine noise. I broke hard, pulled G-forces that grayed my vision, felt the Mustang shudder as it approached stall speed in the turn. My airspeed was too low. I'd burned energy in the fight and needed to dive to regain speed, but diving meant giving up altitude and position, meant becoming vulnerable. Then I heard it, the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard, American voices on the radio. Bandit attacking B-17, this is Red Flight moving to engage. Other Mustangs from my group had broken off from the formation and were diving to support me, had seen what was happening and violated doctrine just like I had to help. 4 more P-51s against 2 FW-190s meant the fight was over. The Germans recognized they were outnumbered and dove away, breaking off the engagement, disappearing into cloud cover below. I was alive somehow, despite doing everything wrong tactically, despite engaging 4 fighters alone, despite giving them shots at my 6. Tennessee Belle was intact, engine running smoothly, controls responding normally, not a scratch despite the furious combat. And most importantly, the B-17 was still flying, damaged and descending, but under control, heading toward England at maybe 2,000 feet altitude. I formed up on the bomber, positioned myself where the crew could see me, waggled my wings to let them know I was there to protect them the rest of the way home. I could see the damage now that I was close. The B-17's number 3 engine was completely gone, burned away to just the mount. Number 4 was windmilling, propeller feathered, no power. The tail was shot up, the vertical stabilizer holed by cannon fire. The ball turret was shattered, the gunner either dead or wounded. But she was flying somehow and the pilot was doing a masterful job of keeping her in the air on 2 engines and damaged controls. The flight back to England took 45 minutes that felt like hours. I stayed with the bomber the whole way, scanning constantly for more German fighters ready to dive on anything that threatened. The other Mustangs from my group stayed with us too, a protective formation around the crippled bomber, abandoning the main formation entirely to see this one crew home. It was a massive violation of doctrine, leaving the bomber stream underprotected to save 1 damaged aircraft. But nobody questioned it. Nobody suggested we should leave the B-17 and return to our assigned position. We'd committed to protecting these 10 men, and we'd see it through regardless of regulations. The bomber made it to the English coast, crossed over land, and headed for the nearest airfield, an emergency landing field near Woodbridge, designed specifically for damaged aircraft. I watched as the B-17 made a straight-in approach. No pattern, no finesse, just a controlled crash onto the runway. The landing gear collapsed on touchdown. The bomber skidded down the runway in a shower of sparks and debris, came to rest halfway down the runway, nose down and tilted. But she was down, was on the ground, and I could see crew members climbing out, see them helping each other out of the broken bomber, see them gathering on the ground, counting heads. 10 men had been in that bomber. 10 men climbed out. I'd saved them, or at least I'd bought them enough time to save themselves. I landed at least an hour later, exhausted and expecting to be court-martialed for abandoning my formation. Captain Morrison, my flight leader, met me on the hard stand as I climbed out of Tennessee Belle. He looked at me for a long moment, then said, "Mitchell, you're either the bravest or the stupidest pilot I've ever seen. You violated doctrine, left your formation, engaged 4 fighters alone, gave them your 6, and did everything wrong from a tactical perspective. You should be dead. And you should have let that bomber crew die because they were already gone, and you couldn't save them. But you did save them. 10 men are alive right now because you made a stupid, irrational, tactically unsound decision. So I don't know whether to recommend you for a medal or a court-martial." I told him I didn't care which. I'd do it again in a heartbeat. Those 10 men's lives were worth any consequence I'd face. He nodded slowly and said, "Yeah, I know you would." That's why I didn't stop you when I saw you dive. Get cleaned up, Mitchell. You've got another mission tomorrow." I never faced a court-martial. Instead, I received a Distinguished Flying Cross for the action, citation praising my courage and initiative in protecting a damaged bomber against superior numbers. But I didn't care about the medal, didn't need recognition or praise. What mattered was that 10 men who'd been dead were alive, had gone home to their families, had decades of life ahead of them, because I'd made a split-second decision to dive into a fight I should have lost. 2 weeks later, I received a letter from the pilot of that B-17, Captain James Sullivan from Ohio. He'd tracked me down through the 8th Air Force headquarters, wanted to thank me for saving his crew, wanted me to know what it had meant to see that lone Mustang diving to their defense when they'd given up hope. He wrote, "We were dead men, Mitchell. We'd said our prayers and accepted we weren't making it home. Then I saw your Mustang diving on those German fighters, saw you engage all 4 of them to give us a chance. I've never seen anything braver or crazier in my life. You saved 10 lives that day. 10 men who will tell their children and grandchildren about the fighter pilot who risked everything for strangers. We'll never forget what you did, and we'll never be able to repay you. Thank you doesn't begin to cover it, but thank you from the bottom of our hearts. You're a hero, whether you accept that label or not." I wrote back, told him I was just doing my job, that any fighter pilot would have done the same, that I was glad they'd made it home, but I kept that letter, treasured it more than the Distinguished Flying Cross, more than any other recognition I received during the war. That letter was proof that the choice had mattered, that the risk had been worth it, that 10 lives had been preserved because of one stupid, heroic, reckless decision made in 3 seconds at 22,000 feet over the North Sea. I flew 60 more combat missions before the war ended, survived them all, came home in June 1945 with 12 confirmed kills and 3 probables and enough medals to fill a shadow box. But that mission on February 14, 1945, Valentine's Day, remained the one that mattered most, the one that defined me as a pilot and as a person. It wasn't my most skilled flying, wasn't the mission where I displayed the most tactical excellence or accumulated the most kills. It was just the mission where I made the right choice when the easy choice would have been to stay with my formation and let those 10 men die. After the war, I stayed in touch with Captain Sullivan and some of his crew. We'd meet at reunions, share stories, maintain the bond that had been forged in those desperate minutes over the North Sea. Sullivan became a commercial airline pilot, flew passengers for 30 years, and he told me once that every time he took off, he thought about that day, about how close he'd come to never having a career or a family, or any of the experiences that made up his life. 3 of his crew became pilots too, inspired by the experience to pursue aviation. 2 became engineers. 1 became a doctor. 1 opened a restaurant. 1 taught high school. 1 raised cattle in Montana. 10 men, each living full lives, each raising families and contributing to their communities, each of them adding value to the world that would have been lost if I'd made the rational decision that day. But the question that haunted me for decades was whether I'd been brave or just reckless, whether I'd made the right decision or just gotten lucky. Military doctrine said I was wrong, that abandoning my formation to protect one bomber endangered the larger mission, that individual heroics don't win wars. But human morality said something different, said that watching 10 men die when you have any chance at all to save them is unacceptable, regardless of doctrine or strategic considerations. The tension between those 2 frameworks, between military efficiency and human compassion, between doctrine and conscience, defined my relationship with that mission for the rest of my life. I came to believe over time that both perspectives were valid, but that the human perspective had to take priority. We were fighting the war to protect human life and dignity and freedom, and if we lost sight of that in pursuit of tactical efficiency, then we were losing the very thing we were fighting for. Doctrine matters, strategy matters, but at the end of the day, wars are won or lost by individual human decisions made in moments of crisis. I made the decision to value 10 human lives over tactical doctrine, and I'd make that same decision again regardless of consequences. Tennessee Bell survived the war, was flown back to the United States in 1945 and eventually scrapped for metal. recycled into cars or appliances or building materials like thousands of other P-51s that were surplus to peacetime needs. I tried to buy her after the war, wanted that specific aircraft that had brought me through the most intense combat of my life. But the Army Air Force had strict policies and I couldn't get permission, so she's gone. Exists only in memories and in the logbooks that recorded her combat missions and kills. But she lives perfectly in my mind. Silver skin gleaming, Merlin engine roaring, guns firing, the finest aircraft I ever flew, and the one I trusted most when trust was the difference between life and death. I'm 95 years old now, one of the last surviving P-51 pilots from World War II. Most of my generation is gone, taken by time rather than enemy fire, and soon I'll join them. When I die, the lived experience of flying the Mustang in combat will die with me. The visceral memory of what it felt like to dive into a swarm of enemy fighters to protect a dying bomber crew. But before I'm gone, I wanted to tell this story one more time. Wanted to preserve the memory of February 14, 1945. Wanted someone to remember that 10 men lived because one pilot made a reckless decision in 3 seconds. The lesson isn't that heroism is always the right choice, or that doctrine should be ignored, or that individual actions matter more than collective strategy. The lesson is that we're all faced with impossible choices, moments where the right thing and the dangerous thing align, where standing by and doing nothing is unacceptable, even when intervening is probably suicidal. In those moments, you don't calculate odds or weigh consequences or think about what might happen. You just act, trusting your training and your aircraft and your luck and whatever divine force watches over fools and fighter pilots. And sometimes, miraculously, you survive, and 10 strangers get to live full lives, and you spend the rest of your life grateful that you made the stupid, heroic, necessary decision. Captain Sullivan died in 2003, lived to see his grandchildren graduate college, died peacefully in his sleep at 82 years old. At his funeral, his son told me that Sullivan had talked about February 14, 1945, every Valentine's Day for the rest of his life, had raised his glass and toasted the fighter pilot who'd saved his crew. He'd told his children and grandchildren the story, made sure they knew that their entire existence traced back to a lone P-51 Mustang, diving into enemy fire to protect strangers. That's the real measure of what that mission meant, not the medal or the citation or the tactical analysis, but the lives preserved, the families that existed, the ripple effects that extended through generations. If this story moved you, if it helped you understand the choices fighter pilots faced and the bonds between fighters and bombers, and the value of individual human lives even in the midst of industrial warfare, I'd be honored if you'd subscribe to hear more stories from World War II veterans. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Remember the P-51 Mustang and the pilots who flew them. Remember the bomber crews they protected. Remember that every human life has value regardless of tactical doctrine or strategic calculations. Thank you for listening to this old fighter pilot's memories of the day he dove into enemy fire to save 10 strangers and discovered what he was really fighting for.